But with Donald Trump now in the White House, is Cuba still a play, both in the United States and among international investors? Steve Marshall is the CEO of Canadian investment company Cuba Ventures, joining us now with some perspective. Thanks so much for joining us. So let's start with the obvious question. If it was very optimistic under an Obama administration, is it just as optimistic under a Trump administration?
Well, I would say so. Donald Trump hasn't said much about Cuba. But
is that good news?
Well, it's not really what he has said or tweeted. It's more what he has done. For example, he chose Greenblatt, Jason Greenblatt, as the key negotiator with Palestine, Israel, and Cuba. Now, the history of Jason Greenblatt is that he was personally in Cuba between 2012 and 2013 on behalf of Donald Trump and the Trump Organization, looking for golf courses. So that is one position, I believe, that is clear. The second is that I was just on Capitol Hill at the beginning of March, and I met with Adriana Espaillat, the congressman, and I also visited Engage Cuba, which is one of Washington's largest lobby groups on behalf of Cuba. And you may be aware that on the 13th of March, we had Jerry Moran, who submitted a bill to repeal the embargo. And he's a Republican congressman. So there are a lot of things going on in the background that would indicate to us as a company that, that the Trump administration is looking at Cuba more positively than the silence would let us believe.
So then what are we talking about in terms of opportunity? Obviously, the first thing that comes to people's mind is an increased flow in tourism. Canadians have been able to go to Cuba all this time.
Right.
Are we starting to see first signs that that's happening with Americans?
Yeah.
And then, you know, what's that going to mean for hotels, airlines, travel industry, and et cetera?
Exactly. Well, I mean, you only have to look at our Q3. You know, we did a massive increase in revenue. Lots of that revenue was from U.S. visitors. You know, there's 5% of the Canadian population visits Cuba, a staggering number, 1.5 million people per year. Now, if we bring into perspective the population of the United States and the cultural similarities between the two nations, can we expect 5% of Americans to visit Cuba? Because if that was the case, then we're looking at between 15 and 18 million people wanting to visit Cuba. So there's a massive opportunity. Cuba is probably this hemisphere's biggest opportunity going forward, especially in a tourism realm. So we're looking at an awful lot of visitors to the island. So, you know, the knock-on effect of all of that is that infrastructure is lacking in Cuba. Anybody who's been to Cuba knows that. They're going to need twice as many or 3 times as many hotels as they have right now, and just about everything else, as a matter of fact. And one of the indicators that I find intriguing is that in 2016, over 1,000 U.S. companies, big U.S. companies, I'm talking about McDonald's and Burger King, registered their brands on the island of Cuba, something that has never happened before. So what did they know that we don't, maybe?
However, I'm sure you saw the headlines about airlines that were paring back or
yes,
cutting back on the size of planes that were on those flights. There's a Fort Lauderdale-based airline, Silver Airways, that basically pulled the plug on a lot of their excitement around Cuba. American Airlines, JetBlue also pared back a little bit. So there was a dialogue at least a couple of months ago that U.S. companies were changing their tune, even if we haven't heard a lot from Donald Trump.
Well, I'll address those two issues. First of all, Silver Airlines and Frontier Airlines pulled out of Cuba. If you read the headlines on Frontier this morning, you'll find that they have other issues associated with the company, and those are probably more financial. With regard to the other companies, we have Royal Caribbean, Celebrity, Norwegian, sailing ships to Cuba every week now. Okay, so you know there are converse views on this, and if you actually look at what happened with the airlines, you will see that JetBlue and American Airlines stepped up and took all of the landing slots from those two smaller airlines that pulled out. So essentially, we have the same amount of interest and we have the same amount of visitors. Now, there's also another issue that most people just are not analyzing, and that is that the lifting of travel sanctions to Cuba does not allow Americans to visit Cuba as Canadians do.
Okay.
So they cannot go to beach resorts, they can't visit Varadero, and they can't visit Cayo Coco and all the places that the Canadians visit. Now, how many Canadians would go to Cuba if Trudeau said tomorrow morning that you cannot go to beach resorts? Okay, so that's why the numbers from the US and the headlines that you're mentioning there say, well, the Americans can now go to Cuba, but not many are going. Well, you know, based on the profile of American travelers, then that is probably correct.
We're pretty much out of time, but just to clarify, in terms of how your business works, the more companies that want to set up shop in Cuba, the more your company ultimately stands to gain.
Exactly, and we also have 432 websites focused on Cuba, 35 million visitors, of which 36.8% are now from the US. So not only can we assist companies in entering into Cuba, but we can also partner and advertise those businesses for them as and when they are approved by the government.
Steve, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Story.
Thank
Steve Marshall, the CEO of Cuba Ventures Corp.